Junji Ito's Uzumaki is one of the most disturbing and creative cosmic horror stories I've ever read. Those of you who haven't read it, Uzumaki is a manga that follows Kiri Goshima and her boyfriend Shuichi Saito, two high school students who begin noticing that the quiet town they live in, Karuzucho, is hiding an eldritch secret. It starts with Shuichi's dad, who's become obsessed with spirals. When Shuichi tells Kiri that his obsession is getting weird, to the point where he's learned to spin his left and right eye independently of each other in spiral patterns, she thinks he's joking. Unfortunately, she will come to learn for herself just how disturbed Shuichi's father really is. Junji Ito's a talented mangaka, and while I haven't read all of his stories, I do own Tomy and a few others, which are still on my ever-expanding TBR. His greatest strength as a storyteller and a mangaka is the way he sets up his paneling, guiding the reader into some seriously disturbing scares. There have been several attempts to adapt Junji Ito's manga stories in anime, and believe it or not, some live-action projects as well. In general, the consensus I've seen about these adaptations is they're not quite as good as the source material. Now, full disclosure, I've not seen them. I've only seen the Uzumaki film from 2000, which I watched more out of morbid curiosity while writing this script than anything else. Other than that, Junji Ito is an artist and storyteller I've really only experienced in manga form. Well, until now that is. It turns out Uzumaki has now been adapted as an anime. And last week, my wife and I sat down and watched the first episode. My wife has read Uzumaki, and she described it as disgusting. She does not handle body horror too well. So I figured now would be a great opportunity to dust off my copy of Uzumaki and give it a reread, analyzing it with a mostly fresh perspective, considering it's been about 7 years since I last read it. I'm going to compare each section of the story with this new adaptation, similar to how I handled the comparison between At the Mountains of Madness and Prometheus in my second Alien video essay, which may or may not be out yet, depending on if Octal has finished his cut. And if you haven't watched my Alien video essays, you should totally queue them up after you're done watching this video. And if at this point you're wondering who the hell I am, hi, I'm Eric Malikyte. My cosmic horror stories have been published by Macabre Inc., and one of my cyberpunk stories recently got published by Grimdark Magazine. I'm a lifelong student and lover of storytelling across a wide gambit of genres and media. And while we're talking about me, my debut cyberpunk/cosmic horror novel, Read Cthulhu Punk, Echoes of Olympus Mons, just got re-released with a sick new cover and a very rough preview for the second book in the series. Links to all of that are down below in the description and pinned comment, of course. With that out of the way, let's get the show on the road. The first chapter of Uzumaki introduces us to Kiri Goshima and her boyfriend Shuichi Saito. Kiri tells us she'd like to share with us the strange events that took place in her hometown, Karuzucho, which I think is the correct pronunciation, but correct me if I'm wrong. The opening splash pages give us a hilltop view of the town that will at first look innocuous to the reader. But as I've said many times on this channel already, good cosmic horror will often alter the smallest details in seemingly normal environments, such as the color of the ocean or the sky. Or in the case of this first splash page, the spiral formations in the clouds and grass Kiri is walking through. Once Kiri reaches the town proper, she realizes she's going to be late to meet her boyfriend at the train station. But curiously, she stops mid-sprint when she notices Mr. Saito, Shuichi's dad, crouched in an alleyway like a weirdo. When she approaches him, he doesn't react at all to her. He's just focused on this weird spiral snail shell stuck to the wall. She, very wisely, I think, decides to leave him alone. When she meets up with Shuichi and tells him about the incident, he tells her that his dad's been acting pretty strange lately. When she asks him to explain, he just says, "Just strange." I mean, I get it. If a Lovecraftian force took over my town, I'd have a hard time bringing it up with my wife, too. Later, when Shuichi and Kiri are in the park, she asks him why he's acting so depressed. He responds by asking her to leave the town with him. Which, okay, 0 to 60 there, guy. When Kiri asks why, Shuichi doesn't want to elaborate at first. He says he feels like they'll go crazy if they stay here, that it's probably obvious to him because he goes to school in another town. When Kiri still doesn't get it, he explains that he feels dizzy every time he gets off the train, like he's going crazy. Then the 5 o'clock air raid siren goes off, interrupting their conversation, and Shuichi loses his shit, covering his ears, screaming that he hates that sound, that it feels like it's piercing his ears. Kiri sidesteps an awkward conversation by telling her boyfriend she needs to get home. While walking her home, he tells her that the lighthouse on the beach is evil, and that the ocean looks totally different in the other town, that the mountains and the winding streets all get on his nerves, like they're keeping him trapped. Then Shuichi proves how very sane he is by talking to himself, saying, "Yes, winding. I'm getting wound up. Spirals. This town is contaminated with spirals." When his girlfriend asks him what the fuck he's on about, he tells her, Nothing. Needless to say, she's pretty damn confused. But the next day, Shuichi's dad comes to visit her dad, Mr. Goshima, at work. He tells Mr. Goshima that he appreciates his hard work, her dad makes ceramic pots and bowls, and that he'd like to place a special order. Shuichi's dad goes on about spirals, how he thinks they're the pinnacle of artistic wonder, how he collects anything and everything that makes a spiral, and that he'd like his ceramic piece to be a spiral, one that'll really make him dizzy to look at. In one particular panel, Shuichi's dad reveals just how far gone he is.
"Mr. Goshima, I find the spiral to be very special. It fills me with a deep fascination, like nothing else in nature. No other shape. I'm sure you will understand how wonderful the spiral is. It is perfect, the most sublime art."
Mr. Goshima agrees to make Shuichi's dad his dish, and we move on to Kiri and Shuichi sitting together on the side of the street. When they discuss Shuichi's dad's visit to Mr. Goshima, Kiri really doesn't see what the big deal is. What's the harm of him collecting spirals? After all, there are worse hobbies, like collecting cigarette butts. Does anyone actually do that? Shuichi tells Kiri she doesn't understand how strange his obsession's gotten, that he stopped going to work and how his eyes start spinning around in circles, the left and right eyes going in opposite directions. Kiri suggests that Shuichi's dad is just trying to get a laugh out of him, and Shuichi decides that it's enough with the bullshit. He'll just show her. If she sees for herself, then maybe she'll understand how bad all of this is. On the way back, though, Shuichi stops and shows her a small stream. The flowing water is full of whirlpools. When Kiri suggests that they could be natural, Shuichi says, "Yeah, maybe, but have you seen all the whirlwinds around town? And the spirals in the clouds, and in the grass, and the walls, and..." She's still not getting what all of this has to do with his dad's obsession. But when Kiri and Shuichi arrive at the house, Shuichi's parents are having it out. You see, Shuichi's mom got rid of the dad's entire collection of spirals. When his mom pleads with her husband to please snap out of this obsession, he has a realization. But not the kind she's hoping for.
"Ha! So it's gone then. Well, I don't care. I don't need to collect spirals anymore. I finally realized that you can make spirals yourself."
And Kiri watches in horror as Shuichi's dad pulls off his glasses and demonstrates for everyone by forcing his eyes to move in spirals. The way this is paneled out in the manga is disturbing. I can almost hear the guy's retinas detaching in my head as each panel focuses on a different eye and its movement. This is probably the tamest example of Junji Ito's paneling skills when it comes to revealing big scares. It's also really impressive that he's able to take what admittedly is a pretty silly concept, like someone spinning their eyes in circles, and attaching this feeling of body horror to it. Kiri's expression in this panel, though, isn't one of fear. She seems more confused than anything else. A few days later, Kiri's dad asks her to deliver Shuichi's dad's spiral ceramic dish. When she gets to Shuichi's house, the dad is alone there, lurking in the dark. When Kiri explains why she's there, he tells her he doesn't need the dish anymore. That, as he explained before,
you can call forth a spiral from within yourself.
And then his tongue slithers out of his mouth and turns into a spiral, which is so fucking weird, and I love it. And Kiri finally screams and gets the hell out of there. As she's leaving, a delivery man comes by and drops off a large cylindrical package, and that's the last time we see Shuichi's father alive. The end of the first chapter reveals that Shuichi's father died. Kiri thinks he fell down the stairs, but Shuichi tells her the truth, That while he and his mother were at the hospital seeking treatment for his dad, Mr. Saito did something to himself. And the paneling here is great. They find a large, circular wooden crate, and when they open the lid, they find that Shuichi's father has turned himself into a spiral. That's how he died. The body horror here is awesome. And you'd be forgiven if you thought this story couldn't possibly get any weirder. Because during the funeral, someone notices that there's something odd in the sky. The reveal leaves off in a cliffhanger though, segueing nicely into the next chapter. The opening splash page shows us that the smoke coming from Shuichi's dad's cremation is creating spirals, that they've come to fill the sky. The crowd is startled, thinking it's a bad omen. Shuichi's mother loses it, which is totally understandable after everything she's been through, telling Shuichi that she can see his father's face in the smoke. To everyone's horror, the smoke spirals down into Dragonfly Pond, where it disappears. But Shuichi's mother will never be the same. Due to her mental break, she's hospitalized where she rambles about keeping him away from her. She freaks out when she sees anything remotely resembling a spiral, such as the back of this nurse's head. She shaves her head and eventually goes so far as to cut off her fingerprints with scissors, which I won't show here, of course. Later, when discussing her progress with the doctor, Shuichi notices that there's a diagram of the human body and brain behind him. He begins to hyper-focus on it as the doctor explains that Shuichi's mother would be best treated at a larger facility in another town, until he realizes that the diagram of the ear reveals that there is a spiral inside each of the ears, the cochlea. He's worried his mother is going to see the diagram, and, well, I'm sure you can guess. The doctor, of course, notices the horrified expression on Shuichi's face and asks him if there's something disturbing him about the diagrams. Shuichi shuts the conversation down and gets his mother out of there before she notices what's on the poster. That night, a centipede attempts to crawl inside his mother's ear. She catches it and throws her alarm clock at it. The thing spirals in on itself, and Shuichi's mother sees the centipede's features transform into her husband, as he was when she and Shuichi found him dead inside the crate. And he tells her that she still has spirals in her body, that he wants to crawl inside her ears so badly. Later, while Shuichi and Kiri are visiting her, his mom loses it, demanding to know what he saw in the diagram. When Shuichi feigns ignorance, she hobbles out into the hallway and confronts the doctor herself, who's removed the posters of the inner ear. When the doctor explains he removed the poster because it wasn't accurate, she doesn't believe him, rifling through his books for another diagram. Eventually, Shuichi gets her back to her room. That night, the nurse tells Shuichi's mother that this is the last night she'll be on the IV, that tomorrow she'll be transferred to another hospital. When she leaves, the liquid in the IV transforms into a whirlpool. She sees her husband's face and hears him calling out to her, telling her that there are spirals in her ears, and asks her to join him in the spiral. This freaks Shuichi's mother out, and she breaks the IV. But as the tube from the IV curls into itself, it too creates a spiral. And now, thinking that her husband crawled into her ears, she takes a pair of scissors and... well, I can't show you, but if you know, you know. Kiri tells us that with her cochlea damaged, Shuichi's mom's balance is permanently ruined, leaving her in a constant state of vertigo, like she's in a spiral. Eventually, she dies, and when she's cremated, her ashes make a spiral in the sky as well, ending the second chapter. The third chapter starts a new story of sorts, revolving around Kiri's friend, Azami Kuretani. Kiri tells us that Azami is really popular with the boys, that she's always having to beat them off with a stick, basically. She's also really good at giving them the cold shoulder. One day, during gym class, Kiri's friends tell her she shouldn't be hanging around Azami, that she uses her good looks to get boys. Someone makes a comment that Azami has special powers over people, then it has something to do with the mark on her forehead. When Kiri tells Azami about all the terrible things her friends said, Azami says she does have a mark on her forehead, but she got it trying to impress a boy when she was little, that she fell off of a jungle gym. She does think it's ironic that ever since then she's been able to have any guy she's ever liked. Sometime later, when Kiri is walking home, Azami runs up to her, asking why she's not going to walk home with her. When Kiri reveals that she's going to visit someone, Azami guesses that she's going to see her boyfriend, and also weirdly demands to meet him. And for some reason, Kiri agrees to let her meet Shuichi. But when Azami is introduced to Shuichi, he freaks out, thrusts his index finger at her, and tells her to leave his house and never return. Kiri apologizes about her boyfriend's behavior, explaining that he's been acting pretty strange lately. Earlier, she revealed that he hasn't been going to school after the death of his parents. Which, fair. Azami shrugs this off, saying that he's probably just stressed. But when Kiri confronts Shuichi on the phone about it later, he explains that he feels incredibly drawn to Azami, that she's a spiral. And the next day, Azami pays Shuichi a visit, telling him that no boy has ever rejected her, that she won't stop until she has him. But somehow, Shuichi knows that Azami has something on her forehead, and it's revealed that the half-moon scar has transformed into a spiral. Shuichi warns Azami to get out of town, to go to school somewhere else. Kiri tells us Azami does not heed his warning, going so far as to convince her parents to rent an apartment in Karuzocho. Night after night, Azami pounds on Shuichi's door, demanding he let her have him, and night after night, he refuses. Kiri eventually tells her to knock it the fuck off and stay away from him, but Azami refuses, claiming that she'll make Shuichi care about him eventually. A whirlwind rips between them, blowing Azami's bangs away from her forehead and revealing that the spiral is now digging into her skull, which is an awesome visual. After this, Azami stops going to school. Kiri tries to see her at home, but no one answers. Then, one night, Shuichi gives Kiri a call at home, asking her if she knows anyone named Okada. When Kiri says no, Shuichi says he's asked him to meet him at the park to talk about her. He thinks he has a crush on Kiri. But before Kiri can finish telling him she has no idea what's going on, he hangs up on her. Naturally, she runs right over to the park, where she finds Azami wearing a hat that conveniently covers her right eye. When Kiri asks if she's okay, Azami says that her right eye won't focus, and asks Kiri to take a look. She takes her hat off, revealing that the spiral has consumed her eye, in a paneling job that I'm sure has given plenty of people nightmares. Meanwhile, Okada is meeting with Shuichi. Azami finally shows up, and Okada reveals that Azami put him up to the whole thing, that she promised to go out with him if he did. But Azami doesn't care about Okada or her promises. When Okada gets angry and swipes her hat away, everyone is horrified to see that the spiral has consumed most of her face, and it takes Okada next. Through this series of panels, not only is Okada's body swallowed in a delightfully weird fashion, but Azami's arms and the rest of her body are as well. Moving on to Chapter 4. In the opening pages of the next chapter, Kiri and her brother Mitsuo are watching the smoke spiral down into Dragonfly Pond from what they think is another cremation. When they return home, Kiri realizes that the smoke from her father's kiln is creating spirals in the sky too. Her mother tells her that he's been up all night and won't let her see what he's so obsessed with. When Kiri goes to investigate, her father yells at her, telling her to go back inside and stay away from the kiln. Later in Midoriyamashi, I think I'm pronouncing that right, hopefully, Kiri's father unveils his latest pottery creations to some of his regular customers. But these are twisted and mangled things compared to the pieces he used to make. In fact, many of them are covered in spirals, if not twisted into spirals themselves. Ultimately, no one buys any of these new pieces. But when Mr. Goshima brings them home, Kiri, her brother, and her mother all notice that there are faces in the pottery. Not only that, but they look a lot like Shuichi's parents. 4 faces in total are discovered in these pieces. The other 2 are identified as other people who were cremated. When Kiri rightly calls her dad out, asking why he would make these horrible things, he explains that he didn't do anything. Ceramics are from earth and fire. In other words, it's the work of nature. We try our best with human hands, but sometimes nature can create things beyond our imagination. After all, most shapes are really patterns, but we can only see a piece of them at a time. Judging from Kiri's expression, I don't think she's buying it. The next day, while preparing a lunch to take to Shuichi, Kiri's mother strongly suggests that she should invite her boyfriend over for dinner, and she practically drags him kicking and screaming. Shuichi explains that it's not her. He just doesn't like going over to her house because of how close it is to Dragonfly Pond. You know, the body of water that keeps consuming spiraling plumes of human ashes? Yeah, I wouldn't want to be near there either. But Kiri does get Shuichi over to her house for dinner. At first, things seem like they're going okay. Shuichi is clearly starved as he's wolfing down spaghetti like no one ever has. At least until he notices that there are spirals on the plate and he freaks the fuck out. When confronted about the spirals, Mr. Goshima claims it was the only plate he had that was flat enough. When asked what the fuck he was thinking serving Shuichi with something so grotesque, he claims it's a work of art. And you know, if anyone was going to appreciate something like that, it would have to be Shuichi. And then he goes on a tirade about how Shuichi's father understood his art, understood the beauty of the spiral. When Shuichi asks where he got the clay, Mr. Goshima tells them all he got it from Dragonfly Pond. Shuichi runs out, holding his mouth like he's gonna barf. And when Kiri finds her father later, he's emerging from Dragonfly Pond like a damn deep one, carrying a bucket filled with clay. When Kiri peers in on her father's workshop, she finds it's full of normal pottery. And quite disturbingly, he says that's how they always look before they go in the kiln. Later that night, Kiri hears a roaring sound coming from outside and goes to her bedroom window, only to see and hear that it's coming from the kiln. When she goes down to investigate, she finds her father asleep. She, of course, can't help herself and peers into the kiln, leading to an excellent page scare where the pottery is screaming like the souls of the damned, calling out for Shuichi to end their pain. Later, Kiri can't get the voices out of her head. When Shuichi calls her, he asks if she's okay, but she tries to play it off like nothing's wrong. But somehow, Shuichi can hear the voices over the phone. The voices that we assume are only in Kiri's head. When she insists she isn't lying, he hangs up and charges over to Mr. Goshima's kiln. During the confrontation, Shuichi smashes the kiln with a giant brick, and all of the twisted, mangled pots spill forth, burning down Kiri's home and destroying what remains of the kiln. Rude. When it's all over, Mr. Goshima is pleased to find that some of his pottery survived the fire. I just love how Junji Ito managed to make pottery disturbing. That in and of itself is a massive accomplishment. On to chapter 5, which is a bit of a Romeo and Juliet story. Kiri witnesses a fight breaking out between two families on the street. The family lives in the same row house, like a duplex. There are quite a few of these row houses around town, decaying and falling apart. Most of them are situated between the nicer homes. This family is extremely poor, but instead of finding a kind of camaraderie, their families deeply despise one another, and somehow Kazunori and Yoriko fell in love. The families want to tear them apart, keep them from seeing each other. Kiri finds Kazunori nursing a bruised face after the whole thing, and they end up talking for a while. Kazunori thinks his family is twisted, that their hearts are bent out of shape. I wonder if that's foreshadowing or something. Upon returning home, Kazunori gets an earful from his parents, who take turns shouting through the walls at their neighbors. Kazunori and Yoriko eventually snap and try to run to each other, only to be dragged back inside by their parents. Later, Kiri asks Shuichi if there's any way to help them, but he says that they're doomed. Their row house has been cursed by the spiral, and then he asks her to run away with him again. Great timing, guy. Real smooth. Kiri shouts at Shuichi and leaves, feeling he's really insensitive, no doubt. On the street, she finds the two families fighting again. Kazunori and Yoriko have run away, and the families are searching for them. Inside one of the abandoned row houses, Kazunori and Shuichi are hiding and getting some bonus snuggle time in. They hear a shuffling sound and watch as two intertwined snakes that totally have nothing to do with something horrible that's going to happen in the near future. Right? Come shuffling through the dilapidated building. At first, Yoriko thinks they're fighting, but Kazunori points out that they're making love before the entwined snakes fall through a hole in the floor. Eventually, Kiri discovers Yoriko and Kazunori hiding out as they make a pact to run away and elope. But Yoriko's father charges into the row house and punches Kazunori in the face, dragging his daughter kicking and screaming again. Kiri offers to help Kazunori any way she can, but somehow doesn't notice that his torso is twisted up. Wow. She's not very observant, is she?
Hey, honey?
Yeah?
Where's the Cholula?
Shuichi and Kiri agree to help Kazunori and Yoriko escape, but the family sees them leave the row house together and give chase. This leads them to the beach, where the families have it out one last time before the spiral finally gets its way. Kazunori twists himself up like a snake and asks Yoriko to do the same. They entwine with each other, and as the families are asking if they're okay, they slither into the ocean and disappear. As far as scares go, I think this is probably the weakest chapter so far. But I quite enjoy the twisted play on Romeo and Juliet. Oh look, I made a pun! Chapter 6 is titled Medusa, so you know it has something to do with hair. But not snakes, ironically. I guess Junji Ito didn't want to repeat himself after the last chapter. The chapter opens with a dead student on the pavement. Kiri tells us that he was playing on the roof of the school, balancing on the handrail when he slipped and fell to his death. Strangely though, he's smiling. Kiri and her friend Sekino are walking through the hall at school, trying to wrap their heads around what happened. Sekino thinks the kid wanted to be noticed, to stand out, and it turns out Sekino has a similar desire. Kiri says she doesn't care about that kind of attention. In the next scene, Kiri and Shuichi are in his house, and Shuichi tells Kiri that this attention-seeking business is part of the curse of the spiral. Kiri's understandably a bit sick of this spiral business, but she immediately thinks of Sekino and wonders if she's okay. Shuichi notices that her hair is getting pretty long and tells Kiri that she should probably get a haircut. And wouldn't you know, the next day at school, Kiri's hair starts curling in on itself like a bunch of spirals. Sekino helps her braid her hair to try to get it under control, but the hair basically has a mind of its own now and rejects the hair ties. When Kiri tries to get a haircut, her hair attacks the barber. The barber recoils in terror, screaming that Kiri is a monster. The next day at school, Kiri's hair is even more ridiculous. And admittedly awesome. The students in the hall seem to be enamored with Kiri's hair. A teacher tries to get her to stop distracting people and ends up hypnotized by one of her twirling, spiraled locks. Sekino comments that she didn't know Kiri had it in her and that she takes this as a personal challenge. Crowds start following Kiri around town, and she notices that someone in the crowd isn't too happy to see what's happened to her hair. When she sees Shuichi turn away from her, she breaks down and cries. This poor fucking girl. Some time passes, and Kiri notes that her hair is draining all of her strength. She's looking absolutely ragged the next time she's wandering about, being followed by townsfolk. This time, though, Sekino shows up and reveals that Kiri isn't the only one with gravity-defying hair curls, saying,
See? Now I have something worth looking at. I won't lose to you.
Days pass, and the school is divided between Kiri stands and Sekino stands, leading to a standoff between the two girls in the courtyard where their hair actually starts strangling each other. Eat your heart out, Kill a Kill. Shuichi tries to intervene with a pair of scissors, but Kiri's hair reacts defensively and wraps his whole body up. Kiri's too tired to move, so Sekino takes this to mean she's won. She ends up wandering the streets, gloating about being the most attractive woman in the whole town. Ha, love the pun. But Shuichi's not done yet, and while wrapped up in Kiri's hair, manages to cut it off of her head, freeing her from the spiral's grip, at least for now. Sekino is not so lucky, however, and ends up bracing herself around a telephone pole. Her hair entwines with the pole, unfurling and growing even larger. Kind of like a houseplant that's grown way too large. And Sekino dies there. Her hair literally sucks the life out of her until her skin sags on her skeleton like a wet sack. I want to start off this section by stating that an adaptation does not need to copy every single aspect of a story. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be an adaptation. What works in comic books and manga might not work in animation or film. However, most manga to anime translations are incredibly faithful to the source material. But in my opinion, changing the source material isn't really a problem that this particular adaptation of Uzumaki has. The Uzumaki anime was produced by Production IG in William Street in association with Adult Swim and is directed by Hiroshi Nagahama. The opening of the anime is both similar and pretty different from the manga. We jump right in with Shuichi explaining his father's obsession, complete with an animated version of his eyeballs spinning. We blow past a lot of the information and weird behavior that Chapter 1 of the manga built up to slowly. Kiri's reaction to Shuichi is also more playful. It doesn't really have an opportunity to breathe between each of the strange reveals that happen with his father. In fact, this episode seems to adapt several stories outside of the original order. And while adaptations are bound to do things like that, I think the choice to adapt the Azami and the Katayama stories on top of the majority of the first 2 chapters was a mistake, as it takes away from the slow burn of the strange events building on one another. As it is, the first episode feels a lot like it's racing through these scenes and leaning way too heavily on exposition. The imagery is suitably disturbing, but it's lacking the build-up. If an adaptation is to succeed, it still needs to embody the essence of what made the original great. As I've said before on this channel, understanding tone and mood is extremely important. For the most part, this adaptation understands the weird Lovecraftian tone of the manga, but its pacing is so fast it actively undermines the tone and mood the episode seems to be going for. By blending these seemingly unrelated stories together to the point where large portions of each story are omitted, we lose a lot of the impact from each scare. I will say I appreciate that this show is presented in black and white. That's kind of a ballsy move. I don't think the visuals would be nearly as effective or unsettling in color, but I really wish they would have taken their time with this episode. There's also something to be said about how Junji Ito's paneling and pacing in his mangas actively force the reader to be a participant in how quickly the story unfolds. Each time you turn the page, you're actively inviting yourself to be scared or disturbed. Without that participation, even something as seemingly small as turning a page to reveal the horror of what Shuichi's father has become loses some of its original creepiness, even if the visuals are still disturbing. Volume 1 of Uzumaki only went up to Chapter 6 of the manga. The anime adaptation, and the extremely cheesy 2000 live-action film adaptation, all seem to adapt the chapters out of order. And while ordinarily an adaptation would be able to do this with little trouble so long as appropriate changes are made to the story, both adaptations make the strange choice to adapt scenes almost as a one-to-one translation of the manga's panels. In the anime adaptation, this leads to the 4 chapters it adapts feeling like they're totally unrelated to each other. It comes off like a bunch of random crap is happening. And while this feeling isn't entirely missing from the manga, as the spiral phenomena itself is not supposed to be understood, that's part of the point. This comes off more like incompetence in the adaptation than anything else. Because as you're about to see, the anthology-style storytelling in Uzumaki contributes to its overall tone and mood, and it gives the strange happenings around the town a lot of weight as they become more and more bizarre. Let's take a look at the remaining 4 chapters in the first half of the manga. Chapter 7 is called Jack in the Box and revolves around a 7th grader with the annoying habit of surprising people. His name is Mitsuru Yamaguchi, and wouldn't you know it, he's got a thing for Kiri. One day, while Kiri and her new friend Shiho are walking through a cemetery, her friend tells Kiri that they've started burying people again. And for some reason, Kiri doesn't get it, asking why. Probably because she's blocking things out. I mean, that's a whole bout of madness in Call of Cthulhu. Shiho understandably wonders if Kiri's blind and points out the black spirals that dominated the sky every time someone was cremated. Rumor has it that even when people die in town but are cremated elsewhere, their ashes still make a spiral. Shiho says she's getting creeped out with all the talk about dead people, and they proceed to GTFO. But not before Mitsuru scares the living crap out of Kiri and Shiho. Mitsuru asks Kiri out again, and when Kiri rejects him, he swears that someday Kiri will go out with him as the girls are leaving. But he just won't quit, surprising Kiri by popping out of a damn trash can of all things and screaming outside her apartment. Eventually, he gives her a present, a box and wrapping paper. Gee, I wonder what this could be. But when Kiri tries to return the gift, Mitsuru gets another idea, steps out into the street, and shouts that his love for Kiri will stop an oncoming car. He dies in a particularly brutal fashion. His body becomes entwined with the wheel to the point that emergency workers have to use a blowtorch to disentangle his remains. Because of the nature of Mitsuru's death, his family's forced to have a closed casket funeral. Later, Kiri's sitting in her room feeling guilty and decides to open Mitsuru's gift to her. And it's a fucking Jack-in-the-Box. Guess he got one last surprise on her, huh? Or did he? And then the Jack-in-the-Box starts talking to Kiri, telling her Mitsuru's death is all her fault, that he died for her, and that he'll soon be coming back for her. When she tells Shuichi about it on the phone, he insists they do something about this. So Shuichi and Kiri do the only truly sensible thing and head to the cemetery, where he plans on stabbing a wooden stake through Mitsuru's heart to keep him from coming back to life. Kiri doesn't think he's a vampire, but goes along with it anyway. When Shuichi digs up Mitsuru's grave, they both note that the smell is absolutely awful. Kiri says there's no way he can come back to life if he's already decomposing. But when Shuichi pries the nails out of Mitsuru's coffin, it pops open like, you guessed it, a Jack-in-the-Box. Kiri and Shuichi run away and Mitsuru's body starts after them by, and I'm not joking, bouncing like a spring. The paneling here is both comical and terrifying. Remember when I said comedy and horror are good bedfellows in another video? This is a really good example. Mitsuru's legs and pelvic area are slowly destroyed, revealing an actual giant spring inside his torso. Shuichi says that it was most likely the automobile suspension spring, guessing that it was never removed from his body. Which is probably physically impossible, but this is a supernatural horror story where people turn into human serpents, so... Chapter 8 is called The Snail, and if you've seen the first episode of the anime adaptation, or you've read the manga already, you know where this is going. Kiri and her friend are sitting in class observing the rain. Her friend mentions that it hasn't rained in a while, and Kiri says it looks like the storm could last 4 days. The whole class is then surprised when one of their fellow classmates shows up late. His name's Katayama, he's extremely slow, and he's soaking wet. Sumura teases that Katayama is the ultimate slowpoke, and the whole class laughs. Because asshole kids. Katayama slowly makes his way over to his seat, and Kiri and her friend remark that Sumura is a jerk, but he's not wrong. Katayama is incredibly slow. Later during gym, the kids are playing volleyball, and when the ball comes for Katayama, his arms barely move to catch it. This loses the game for the team, something Sumura isn't too happy about. Sumura decides to bully Katayama in the boys' locker room. He tells his buddies that since Katayama is so slow dressing and undressing himself, they'll just go ahead and help him with that too. The scene that follows will not be shown here, but they strip Katayama naked and drag him into the hall. Gee, I do hope this bully faces karma in the future, where they see that a spiral has formed on Katayama's back. The next day, Katayama is once again late to class. This time, however, there's something strange growing out of the small of his back. When the class points this out, Katayama says it must have swollen up. Kiri notices the spiral pattern and looks more than a little nervous. And as the rainy days keep coming, Katayama continues to arrive late, and the spiral bulge on his back continues to grow. Until one day, he arrives and literally slithers through the door like a snail. He crawls all the way to his desk. If you think this is as strange as it gets, just wait. By the time Friday arrives, they notice that Katayama has climbed the walls of the school, clinging to the walls like a snail. Eventually, the school calls Katayama's parents to come pick him up, but when they arrive, they basically think they're being pranked and storm off in a huff, and the school decides to keep Katayama as a pet, complete with his own enclosure. And of course, Sumura decides to poke Katayama's eye with a stick because he's a shithead. Kiri and a friend chastise him, and he bites back with,
"Get off my back! He's just a slug now. He's not human anymore."
Gee, I sure wish this guy would face some karma or something. Curiously though, on the next page, Sumura is perpetually hunched over the water fountain as if his thirst has no end. His friends remark that he's gonna drown himself if he doesn't stop, and Sumura's face is covered in sweat. When his friends leave him behind, Sumura asks them to wait up, and they chastise him for being too slow. The next day, Kiri and her friends notice that Katayama has withdrawn into his shell now that the rain has stopped, and they decide to give him some water. Some time passes, and on another rainy day, the teacher, Mr. Yakuda, tells the class that Sumura has gone missing. Kiri notices sounds coming from the window and is horrified to see a giant slug slithering up the window. And if you haven't guessed yet, yes, it's Sumura. Karma has turned this asshole into a slug. The school decides to put Katayama and Sumura in the same enclosure. Kiri's friend is amused to see that they get along much better now, and then the class notices that they're doing something else. They're mating. Snails are apparently hermaphrodites. Several weeks pass, and Kiri, her friend, and the teacher, Mr. Yokota, notice that Katayama and Samura have escaped their enclosures by digging themselves out. They immediately go looking for them in the hills. The teacher is worried they might have laid eggs. Eventually, they find the eggs, and the teacher decides to stomp on them, saying that they must destroy any other eggs they find. But they never find any other eggs, and they never find Katayama or Tsumura. A few days later, Mr. Yokota slithers into the classroom, having fully transformed into a humanoid snail. I think there are a lot of really nice ideas in this chapter. It's honestly one that stuck with me long after I'd finished the manga. The idea of a classmate turning into a giant snail sounds silly, but the way it's executed reminds me of the Shadow over Innsmouth. It's honestly a little sad that the adaptations have never allowed this story the proper space to breathe. They're usually too concerned with covering the highlights, forgetting the weird karmic cycle between Katayama, Tsumura, and Mr. Yokota. Chapter 9 is, so far, my favorite chapter in my reread of Uzumaki. It's called The Black Lighthouse, and while there are plenty of Lovecraftian stories involving lighthouses and dark towers, this one is pretty unique. The chapter wastes no time getting into it, playing off Shuichi's crazed comments at the beginning of the story when he claimed the lighthouse was evil. One night, the lighthouse suddenly erupts with twin vortexes of light. Kiri describes it as,
"It swirled like a tornado over the rooftops."
And seriously, a tornado of light is such an awesome Lovecraftian concept. I'm only slightly jealous I didn't come up with it. The light has the town gathering before the lighthouse, wondering what the hell's going on. Kiri is there too, looking on from afar, looking about as nervous as she usually does. Night after night, the lighthouse repeats this cycle. Twin vortexes of light erupt, and the townspeople bathe in the light. One night, at the dinner table, Kiri's brother says he thinks the light is awesome. It's like a giant robot spitting out a death ray. And I love this little panel of the kid miming acting like a robot. It really shows Junji Ito's more playful side. If you haven't seen this meme about Junji Ito and Lovecraft, it should tell you everything you need to know about him. He's apparently just a really nice guy. But this is also effective in another way. When writing horror stories, and especially something as thematically bleak as cosmic horror, it's important to inject humanity into your characters. Humor and genuine human moments like this help to show readers what the characters stand to lose if, and in the case of cosmic horror, when things ultimately go to shit. If a story like this is a roller coaster, you gotta reach the top of that lift hill before sending them spiraling into the abyss. The next day, a group of men enter the lighthouse to figure out why it's suddenly reactivating after years of being defunct. And that night, the lighthouse once again ignites. The people are mesmerized and begin displaying odd behaviors. Kiri stops an old woman on the street who's been walking around in circles, and she says that she's walking home, though it's taking longer than usual. Kiri spots a man at the train station doing the same thing. He's calling for help, claiming he can't stop. And another woman's doing it too, panting like she's out of breath. Later, a fishing boat is found capsized at the base of the lighthouse. The locals explain that she ran aground, and the crew ran around in circles until they fell into the ocean. One was rescued, and 2 are missing. And speaking of missing, it turns out the men who entered the lighthouse to investigate haven't come out. This is all pretty worrisome for Kiri, who's there with her brother Mitsuo. Mitsuo's friends call for him, saying they're going to get closer to the lighthouse. Before Kiri can do anything about it, they're already playing around it. She calls for him, and it looks like he's about to listen to his sister when the boys discover that the door to the lighthouse is open, and all of them end up running inside. Kiri chases after them, running up the spiral staircase, and Kiri chases after them, running up the spiral staircase, and runs up the spiral staircase. After a while, she grows tired. The lighthouse is way taller than she thought it would be, and soon she comes to a portion of the stairwell where there are no windows, and the walls and floor are covered in glowing spiral patterns. Yeah, totally not a bad omen, right? And as if that isn't bad enough, she finds several bodies, all of them burnt extra crispy. At first, she worries one of them could be Mitsuo, but quickly realizes they're all adults. Gee, I wonder if these could be the men who disappeared inside the lighthouse. Nah, probably a coincidence. Eventually, Kiri is relieved to find 2 of the boys, who are cowering on the staircase next to 2 more charred bodies. They tell Kiri that Mitsuo and the other boy went ahead to the top of the staircase. When Kiri reaches the top, we get this awesome splash page, what my brain has always interpreted as an oozing, fleshy Lovecraftian object where the main lamp should be. But we'll come back to this in a second. When Kiri asks the boys to leave, they say they're too scared. Then Kiri puts two and two together. The weird spiral orb had to have been the lamp. It must have gotten so hot that it melted, noting that
It was a Fresnel lens, which normally has concentric patterns, but because of the melting, it looked like a spiral.
And I just want to pause to talk about this. It's probably no accident that the lamp's molten, dripping surface looks somewhat flesh-like, but introduces information that contradicts what our eyes perceive. This is one of the most effective uses of subtle Lovecraftian imagery, by introducing a plausible explanation for many of the phenomena in the story, except the slug boys, ain't no explaining that. It sort of gaslights the reader into wondering if Kiri is a reliable narrator. Is the sky really the wrong color? Are the people of Innsmouth really fish people, or is the narrator just a xenophobic prick? This is something I did with the main character, Hal Leon, in my debut cyberpunk/cosmic horror novel, Echoes of Olympus Mons. Hal is kind of an edgelord, delighting in being despised by the dean and entertaining fringe, borderline pseudoscientific theories. The whole time, the reader is meant to wonder if he really is crazy, if maybe there's a chance everyone around him is right. All of this is meant to make the reader wonder if the final Lovecraftian reveal is real or if he's just imagining it. And it's a thing I hope to perfect in future stories, because I'm never going to stop growing as an artist. Anyway, Kiri wonders what time it is, looks out the window at the horizon, and sees that the sun is setting. Now she's panicked, and rushes the boys down the staircase as quickly as she can. But one of the boys trips on the way down as the bulb ignites. She reaches for him, but it's too late. She's forced to watch this poor kid go up in flames before they all fall down the rest of the staircase. When she wakes up, Mitsuo is next to her, but the other boys are gone. They made it outside. The following day, 6 bodies are discovered inside the lighthouse, and that night, it ignites once again, its spiral vortexes of light filling the night sky. Kiri says that,
And still, every night, the lighthouse streams forth a swirling glow. They say they'll demolish it someday.
Chapter 10 is called Mosquitoes, so you know this is going to be gross. And I hate mosquitoes with a passion. Our old rental had this retaining wall that emptied rainwater into our yard, basically turned half the yard on that side into a swamp, and the mosquitoes were a nightmare year-round. The best way I can describe this chapter is Evil Dead plus mosquitoes, and it's awesome. So after the events of the last chapter, Kiri's been spending time in the hospital recovering from her burns.
I see your continuity, and I like it.
And Kiri tells us that since the summer season started, their town has been swarmed with mosquitoes. While lying in bed, she happens to spot one of the blood-sucking vermin and tries to shoo it away. But strangely, the mosquito flies in a spiral pattern, and this lulls her to sleep.
I'm sure that's not an omen or anything.
Later, Kiri and her friend who's visiting her are walking in the hospital courtyard.
And I believe this is the only friend, other than Shuichi, who hasn't so far died a horrible death because she stuck around for several chapters. So I'm sure this will end well for her.
When they notice a whirlwind in the distance. Only it's not a whirlwind, it's a massive vortex of mosquitoes. Kiri's friend tells her it's a mosquito column. Apparently,
That's what they call it when they swarm like that. They're all male mosquitoes waiting to mate.
Oh, and by the way, I looked this up and discovered, to my horror and discomfort, that this is a real thing.
yeah, mosquito columns. Well, there's another reason to never go outside again. Anyway, Kiri's wondering if this is another sign of the spiral when they discover a corpse in the bushes, and it's covered in little holes.
Wonderful.
Later, Kiri notices that several doctors are rushing a pregnant woman through the hospital. She recognizes the woman as her cousin, Kieko, and after paying her a visit in the maternity ward, asks her if she's okay. Kieko says that she just needs to rest, that she throws up anything she eats. Kiri notices that her cousin's covered in mosquito bites, and asks the nurse if that's why she's sick. The nurse can't rule it out, but thinks it's mostly in the girl's head. Kiri helps her cousin unpack and discovers a large device wrapped up in cloths. And when she asks her cousin what it could possibly be, Kieko sidesteps that shit and asks her to put it in her nightstand. The next morning, a bunch of men are found dead inside their rooms. Their bodies are covered in holes, just like the body found in the bushes. One of the patients wonders if they were murdered, but notes that all they heard last night were the buzzing of mosquitoes. Kiri visits Kieko later and tells her about the panic. then apologizes. After all, she's got a little one growing inside her to worry about, and shouldn't be stressing about such things. Like people mysteriously dying in the hospital where she's staying at. Later, Shuichi makes his first appearance in several chapters and tells Kiri she should probably check out of the hospital while giving everyone else the shifty eyes. That he feels something is wrong with the hospital. But the nurse interrupts, telling Kiri they've run out of space in the maternity ward and her cousin will have to bunk in her room. Kiri agrees without hesitation, but Shuichi tells her she can't let her cousin stay, that he gets a weird feeling from her. And Kiri gets offended, which is fair in a way, but part of me does wonder if Kiri is blocking out everything that's happened to her, because Shuichi is almost always right. A mosquito flies into the room and Shuichi freaks out, grabbing a can of bug spray, which he obviously got from his shopping bag, and sprays it to death. Everyone gets super annoyed at him for this, cause poison, and the nurse tells him he has to leave after opening all of the windows. Shuichi leaves and Kiri apologizes for his behavior, saying once again,
"He's been strange lately."
Like, okay, sure, but the whole damn town has been strange, wouldn't you say?
That evening, Kiri wakes up to the sound of mosquitoes filling up the hospital corridors. When she goes to investigate, she sees a group of shadowy figures emerge, covered in mosquito bites. And they're all pregnant women from the maternity ward, and they're all carrying these carpenter's hand drill things. Gee, I wonder what they're going to do with those. And yes, I looked up what these things are, and apparently they're carpenter's hand crank drills. You learn something new every day. Kiri watches with the door cracked as the pregnant not deadites split up, entering all of the rooms. And then they straight up start drilling into motherfuckers and drinking their blood. At some point, it was explained that only female mosquitoes drink blood because they need it to allow their eggs to fully develop. See a parallel here? Kiri makes the mistake of peeking in one of the rooms, and one of the not deadites sees her giving chase. While she's being attacked, a man comes out of his room wondering what all the commotion's about. And this serves as a nice distraction so Kiri can slip back into her room while this poor bastard gets murdered. Interestingly enough, the women use the spiral motion the mosquito used earlier to hypnotize the man to sleep before they drain him of his precious bodily fluids. Before all is said and done, a nurse comes out to see what in the Evil Dead is happening, and she gets got. The women are about to return to the maternity ward to lie dormant for another day when one of them turns and says that a girl, Kiri, saw them. And she must die. Kiri's still watching all this unfold instead of getting her ass out of there. The not deadites swarm her, but she manages to get the door closed before they have a chance to end her. But when she turns around, she sees Kiyiko standing behind her, holding one of those carpenter hand drills.
You know the thing that Kiyiko told her to store in the nightstand?
Kiyiko says,
"Blood! Give me your blood!"
And the maternity ward mosquitoes break open the door, once again swarming on Kiri. But Kiri notices that Shuichi's bug spray is on the floor and sprays them with it before they can get her. The bug spray drives them away. And the next day, the maternity ward and the women who previously went on a vampiric murder spree are all looking pretty normal, caressing their bulging pregnant bellies.
I'm sure we'll never revisit this again. This chapter is awesome. I just love how Junji Ito is able to take a seemingly normal thing like a mosquito and put this bizarre twist on it. The idea that mosquitoes could have this effect on pregnant women, the hand drills, all the subtext, it's all really creative. And then there's the question if it's really the mosquitoes themselves or the spiral's effects on pregnant organisms in general. Excellent cosmic horror.
But the same cannot be said about the second episode of the anime. The second episode of the Uzumaki anime makes the same mistake that the first one does, but seems to dial the frantic pacing up to 11. We get adaptations of and conclusions to Chapter 5, The Twisted Souls, Chapter 6, Medusa, Chapter 7, Jack in the Box, Chapter 8, The Snail, Chapter 9, The Black Lighthouse. And a brief glimpse into Chapter 2, The Spiral Obsession Part 2. If it seems like that's a lot of material to adapt, that's because it is. Each chapter is cut up and sprinkled throughout the episode to varying degrees of effectiveness. And much like the previous episode, a lot of the buildup from each chapter is just missing, leading to each of the conclusions to these stories, and indeed much of the journeys to get to each of those endings feeling super rushed. The individual stories in the manga deal with concepts that would ordinarily feel ridiculous, like someone's hair curling up into spirals and hypnotizing their school into zombies. But Junji Ito's paneling and pacing allows these concepts to develop slowly,
to creep into your subconscious and unnerve you, so that by the time the scares start to unravel, they transform from weird and ridiculous to weird and terrifying. But the anime's pacing and, let's be honest, exposition dumps kills 80% of the dread that each of these stories and situations should have. We get no less than 4 endings before the actual ending of the episode. And to be honest, I was almost worried they'd take the last few minutes to cram in the ending to the Spiral Obsession Part 2 on top of it. The exposition dumps are particularly bad in this episode too. Explanations are just shoehorned into the episode. For example, rather than start the Twisted Soul story with the row houses and Kiri explaining why they are the way they are, and then moving to setting up the warring families and lovers, that particular story decides to start with a scene that originally took place halfway through the chapter. And this leads me to another issue. The show's writing is just not subtle. While Junji Ito's writing in Uzumaki is sometimes a little on the nose, some might even say punny, it always feels believable within the context of the world he's built. But the anime throws subtlety to the spiral winds and takes the dialogue into frankly dumb directions. Such as when Katayama comes into the classroom at the start of the episode and students notice the bulging spiral pattern on his back. No one in the manga version of this story thought it looked like a snail shell. Kiri, in fact, is the only one who comments on the spiral shape it's making. Yet, in the anime, one of the girls says it looks like a snail shell, which not only feels really on the nose, but also ruins the reveal when Katayama finally turns into a human snail. Similarly, the Jack-in-the-Box story feels dumb. Like this kid randomly went from scaring Kiri and being a bit of a creep to jumping in front of a car to prove his love. It's like going from 0 to 60. The Jack-in-the-Box reveal itself is also extremely rushed. He's still holding it after being run over, and then somehow the box pops open before turning into this weird demonic smiling thing. Like the worst analog horror you've ever seen. I'm particularly irritated at the adaptation of the Black Lighthouse. Like I said earlier, it's probably my favorite chapter in the manga, and this adaptation does not do it justice. If you recall, the lighthouse is supposed to have been defunct for years, and when it comes back to life, the light it emits bathes the town in vortexes of light. But in this episode, it just looks like a normal beam of light and comes off like something an intern might make in After Effects. The reveal of the lamp is also kind of disappointing. It doesn't have that flesh-like texture that the original paneling did, kind of ruining the uncanny and liminal feeling we get when Kiri explains that this thing is actually just a melted lamp bulb. The staircase itself is also less effective because Kiri tells us that she's been walking up this thing forever rather than showing us. And while this is something that the manga also does, the anime could have made this feel even weirder by making it take up a larger portion of the runtime to make the viewer feel like she's been doing this for a really long time. I mean, this comes back to my initial point that things that work well in a manga or comic will not work quite as well in animation, right? You gotta play to the medium's strengths. And one thing you have that a manga doesn't is the ability to play with how long scenes take to play out. The ending to the Black Lighthouse is also lackluster and feels poorly animated. And this leads me to the animation. For an anime that was supposedly in development for a really long time, it's really bad in places. There are more than a few run cycles that just look awkward. It's clear most of the budget and effort went into the big scares, but the all-over-the-place pacing ruins those scares. Plus the fact that you're no longer a participant in the story because you're not turning the page. You know what I mean. And it's a real shame because everything else about this show is spot on. The black and white illustrative style, the music, and even some of the animation is on point. Maybe this is a budget issue, but assuming they're going to cover the entire manga in these 4 episodes, it would have been a much smarter move to choose the best chapters from the manga and adapt each one individually so events can feel like they're leading to events. The best thing about the manga is that it feels like the weird phenomena start small and eventually grow increasingly weirder with each chapter. This really should have been a slow burn to capitalize on the feeling of dread in each episode. But as it is, I'm really worried about the last 2 episodes of the anime. Especially because from what I remember, the ending is a real gut punch. One of the best WTF moments in cosmic horror. Anyway, that's where this video is going to end. We've covered half the manga and half the anime. In the next video, we'll look at the other half of the manga and anime and see if the tail end of the adaptation can salvage the story and the horror. But what do you think of this adaptation? Do you agree with my assessment here? Why? Why not? I'd especially love to hear from people who have never read the manga before watching the anime, as your perspective will likely be very different from mine. If you dug this video, do me a favor and like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel if you're not, as only about 5 or 6% of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves weird fiction, Lovecraftian horror, and storytelling breakdowns like this. With any luck, this episode has come out near or around Halloween, so happy Halloween! I'm Eric Malikyte, and I'll see you next time, my fellow deranged cultists.
Blood? Give me your blood!